Fall 1947, spring 1948. So I was back in the field of political work, which was accompanied by a radical change in my personal daily routine. In my position as a production manager, I used to get up earlier than ordinary workers, have breakfast first in the canteen, and come back last and take a walk on weekends. Now I get up one of the last. I have breakfast after the brigades have gone to work. The working day most often begins after dinner, and the most intense work of a propagandist takes place on weekends. I returned to the political unit reluctantly. My young Marxist conviction caught a cold from the cold wind of the events of spring. Ideologists promote criticism and self-criticism, but the blows of criticism are mostly received by subordinates. I was punished. I am still convinced of this, for my great desire to help the editors of the newspaper. Where is the justice in that? What is the reason for the exile to a special regime? And what does it have to do with criticism? I am thoroughly disappointed. My desire to distinguish myself in political work has cooled down and weakened. A year ago, I tried with deep conviction to explain to my comrades the criminal foundations of fascist ideology and to contrast them with the logic and humanity of the teachings of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin. After the experience of all that I had seen in agriculture, and as a result of contacts with the penal officers in the special regime zone, I was ready with a clear conscience to separate Stalin from the forefathers of socialism, since his ideas and the regime existing in the country did not correspond at all to the ideal principles of socialism. This opinion of mine was confirmed by the statements of the Russian people on the basis of trophy equipment, of course with an eye to eye. Lenin, yes, but Stalin? Stalin is a bastard. The most amazing thing is that such dangerous speeches were made in front of prisoners of war. It's the conversation of an old man with a long beard. Apparently, a Russian old believer sticks in my memory. Listen, Kolya, we have such an aura. If you steal a cabbage, you get 5 years. If you steal a basket of cabbage, you're 25 years old. If you sold 100 tons of cabbage on the black market, you'll become a director. And here is another example. At Zavodstroy, prisoners of war took part in the construction of Shopno, 33 for the production of raw materials for artificial fibers. Nearby there were already bare walls of a building more than 100 meters long. There were wooden foreman's booths and smoking rooms for the workers. I was surprised that new buildings were being constructed, but there was no talk of completing the old ones. I inquired about the reason for such mismanagement, and found an informant who referred to the principles of socialist planned economy. According to the plan, funds for capital investments are allocated from above, and some of these funds are spent on previously unfinished objects. Thus, the allocation of funds and the execution of construction work is carried out with a significant shift. When the war started, the building of the central laboratory was considered already built, according to the report, although there were only bare walls. All this confirmed the ineffectiveness of the socialist system, as was written about in the Nazi press, and it turned out to be true. My worldview was in such an uncertain state, so what kind of a propagandist am I in front of the German prisoners? To lie to them? When the priest himself does not believe in God? It was interesting for me to analyze under what circumstances an ordinary prisoner could be susceptible to political re-education. Of course, I ruled out bribery with food, and in Wien. I became convinced that first of all it is necessary to address not the brains, but the stomach of a man. The year 1947 was a hungry year. The civilian population which I had to deal with was starving. The situation was better at the heavy chemical production facilities. Their people were given a lunch which was almost no different from the food of the prisoners. It was winter. It was cold. For a smoke break, Russians and Germans gathered together, warming themselves at the iron stove. Russians took potatoes out of their pockets, cut them into slices and put them directly on the stove, and they treat the prisoners. So we eat on the same level. But the Russian prisoners working next to us eat even worse than we do. A free man can bear hunger more easily than a prisoner who is oppressed by the psychological factor. Shai da kasha, our food. We knew this saying well, but we dreamed of German cuisine, and most of us had all our thoughts centered on the state of our own bodies. The food served in the camp was considered cursed Russian food. Any susceptibility to ideology under these conditions is controlled by one's stomach. So re-education in the Gulag system was an act of bullying and insanity. Any criminal, even a murderer, knows what term he has been given by the court and knows the date of release. And the prisoner? Who? What ideology is there? When we are held hostage in the hands of the victorious power, we can be held captive forever. I didn't know what arguments could break such an opinion. If the propagandist said that the Soviets had preserved our lives and health, I heard in reply, their only aim is to keep the army of eternal slaves working as long as possible. The official position that prisoners of war should atone for the guilt of the German people before the Soviet Union is not at all clear. They reply, why only us? Isn't 2 or 3 years not enough for us? Let them gather there those who did not experience this horror at all. It is very difficult to conduct political agitation in such conditions. The slogan, 1948 is the year of repatriation, gave everyone a bit of hope. But the prisoners don't believe anything anymore. Only the dystrophic and sick, in a word, the inoperable, are returning to their homeland. I moved into the living quarters of the anti-fascist activists. I got to know the older man, Theodore. In terms of justice and ability to communicate with people, he is an old sage, although he is only 5 years older than me. His main task is to defend the interests of ordinary prisoners against illegal and morally inadmissible actions on the part of both the German self-government and the Russian administration. Whether he has any political education, what gods he worships, no one knew or was interested. Theodore speaks a little Russian and is highly respected by Major Reutberg, the chief of the political unit, and Lieutenant Colonel Romanov, the chief in the Soviet administration. How he managed to get into such a position, I have no idea. Repeatedly in his sharp discussions with his superiors, he used my services as an interpreter. He was not an obedient servant. In seeking a just decision, he walked the tightrope like an equilibrist, hindering his superiors in carrying out self-serving measures to the detriment of prisoners of war. But, in fairness, he also decided on punishments for POWs if they violated discipline. With misdemeanors such as petty theft, we had our own methods of education, but as for major ones, this was already decided by the Soviet administration of the camp. I remember such a case. In the winter of 1947-48, GB brigades working on the outside were provided with sheepskin coats, for which people were very grateful, because the frosts were severe and the uniform overcoats of the Wehrmacht did not meet the requirements of the Russian winter. Repeatedly and more often, some ordinary workers reported that their fur coats had disappeared during their stay in the camp. They were not believed. They were not given a new fur coat and had to go to work in a thin overcoat. When among the victims were undoubtedly honest comrades, Theodore took up the cause of the detective. How he created a system of secret police remains a mystery to me. He had exceptional abilities as a hypnotist and used them to investigate minor offences. He may have had telepathic abilities as well. However, he managed to catch the thief in the presence of a representative of the Soviet administration. They did not arrest him on the spot, but secretly followed him to uncover the trade network that transported smuggled goods outside the camp zone. The chief of the organization turned out to be a German battalion commander. He was put on trial. The victims were rehabilitated and received new fur coats, 20 of them. They heartily thanked Theodore, but there was a group of Germans who accused Theodore of betrayal because he had betrayed a German to the Soviet court. The mob chief was given 10 years, but when Theodore returned home in mid-1948, it turned out that the criminal had repatriated before him. The criminal himself, sued the British administration, the basis of the suit, a crime against humanity. There were, thank God, a good number of witnesses who, before this court, exposed the complainant. The result was a complete acquittal for Theodore, but it seems that the fight for justice is uneasy everywhere. He and I have had a very friendly contact since my days at the base. He called me his little brother, and I saw him as a kind of godfather. He knew very well what kind of work I was most eager to do, and he knew that the ability to get involved in an interesting task was one of the positive aspects of my character. So the area of my new activity was to improve the results of production work of our brigade. In this case, I had accumulated a lot of experience in the last camp. At the same time, cooperation with the head of the base of trophy equipment continued. At the factory, I took cards for the card index, and I did the translation at home, in the cozy atmosphere of the living quarters. The most outstanding and instructive event of that period of my political work was the election to the POW self-government in the fall of 1947. The High Command in distant Moscow decided to show the Germans in practice how true democracy functions. The prisoners of war were given the right to choose those comrades whom they considered competent to lead life in the camp. For the elections, each brigade must choose one delegate. The delegates, together with representatives of the political department, must draw up a list of candidates, and the balloting itself will take place at an assembly of delegates. So much for democracy. Theodore listened attentively to the lecture of the deputy, and in response to his request to discuss the case asked him to postpone the debate. What he justified this request with, what exactly happened in the following days. Theodore told me only at the first meeting at home in 1965. As an excellent diplomat, he avoided public discussion. He managed to convince Major Riedberg that only general, equal and secret elections could serve as an example of true democracy. This is what Theodore and the vice police officer agreed on. To propose candidates, a meeting of the entire camp must be held. In order to elect 6 members of the asset, 9 candidates can be proposed, which will be included in the ballot. All prisoners of war will participate in the election with secret ballot. The 6 candidates for whom the majority of votes are cast will be the members of the asset. But, Theodore explains to us, I had to give my word to Riedberg that Erich Meyer and Fritz Muller would definitely be included in the list of candidates. The case concerns 2 individuals who advertise themselves as old communists and who, as everyone knows, work as runners, in the service of both the deputy police officer and the operational commissioner. I have by my word guaranteed their inclusion in the list of candidates, but I have declared myself unable to guarantee the necessary number of votes for acceptance as an asset. Read between the lines, it meant to prevent them from being admitted as members of the asset. That was one task. The other task was to guarantee the desired comrades the necessary number of votes. According to Marxist science, politics is led by the masses. Theodore, on the contrary, explained to us that managers determine the direction of politics, and he immediately demonstrated what kind of manager he was. He prepared a group of supporters by dividing it into 2s. One nominates a candidate and the second, seemingly independently of the first, supports and lists the merits of that person. If the result begins to fluctuate, 2 professional attorneys must intervene and eloquently convince the right choice of the candidate. On the convinced communists prepared speeches more restrained, but with a guarantee of inclusion in the list. The compilation of the list of candidates did not cause any complications. Only one unwanted from the opposition was included, knowing in advance that he would not pass. At the meeting there was a personal presentation of the candidates. People were prepared for this act, speaking for and against. They were divided into tiers. Lower tier as simple workers with simple arguments. 2 speakers per candidate. Middle tier intellectuals with oratorical eloquence and the ability to deflect unwanted arguments, while presenting in bright colours the merits of desirable candidates, 1 speaker per 2 candidates. The upper tier. Lawyers with experience in prosecution and defence and 2 speakers for all candidates as help just in case. The representatives of the individual tiers were led into battle by Theodore with an almost imperceptible wink. He managed to fix in his memory who was among this crowd with what task, and none of the uninitiated managed to notice his directing techniques. A rhetorical battle was unleashed, in the bouts of which the strict orderliness of one side clearly prevailed over the chaotic nature of the other. Heavy weapons, lawyers, did not even have to be brought into the fight. The battle lasted at least 4 hours, and Theodore considered its outcome satisfactory. Zampolit-Reutberg followed the debate with the rest of the political staff. They were served by the camp's official interpreter, who, I think, did his duty honestly. But out of the whole whirlwind of discussion, it was almost impossible to catch the disguised shades of statements to one or another address, especially through an interpreter. As for the old communists, the deputy polite never felt the subtlety of the processing of the candidates he proposed. The balloting was scheduled for the next day off. They handwrote 2,500 ballot forms, prepared ballot boxes and booths. The polling station was decorated with various slogans of an appropriate nature. By agreement with the camp chief, a holiday ration was given on election day. A band played in front of the polling station, and sports competitions were held in the camp area. In short, they created a festive atmosphere. Exactly at 18 o'clock the ballot boxes were opened and votes were counted. The chairman of the election commission announced the result. Theodor Melman, 98. As of our people, none of them got less than 80. I was among them. The old communists are in 7th and 8th place with a result of 20, and the representative of the opposition burned. He received less than 10 of the vote. Zampolit-Reutberg accepted the failure of his pets with honour. The lag of more than 60 made a deep impression on him. As a man of high intelligence, he understood that there was no reason to criticize the organizers of the electoral theatre. Theodore could not be accused of perfidy. This is how true democracy is practiced when there is no organized opposition. That's how I became an elected delegate. Unfortunately, Soviet-style democracy had no concept of delegate immunity. Not even a quarter of a year had passed since the elections when I was again anathematized by the political department. The reason, this time, could not be determined in detail. The process followed the laws of dialectics. A whole mountain of small ideological errors was accumulated in an evolutionary way, and a revolutionary leap was made from the quality of a delegate of the elected supreme body of the camp to the quality of, this time not a labourer. Now I, a political tightrope walker, was given a lifeline by the camp administration in the person of Lieutenant Colonel Romanov. On the territory of the camp stood an unfinished brick building. This building was completed by our masons and other specialists of construction crafts. The two-story building with bunk beds was designed for 1,000 people. A transport with prisoners of war arrived from the Baltic states, each of whom tried twice or many times to find his way home individually, but was once again caught. The camp's roster grew by 500 men. An additional battalion commander had to be appointed. Just at that moment I was relieved of my duties as a delegate of the political staff, and, as it seemed to me, Lieutenant Colonel Romanov was waiting for this occasion. But before finally saying goodbye to the work in the anti-fascist activist group, it is impossible not to mention one man who managed to gain not only the respect of many prisoners of war, but also a deep sympathy. Lieutenant Abramov was a political officer. Strange as it may seem, hardly any of the prisoners knew his name and patronymic, because it was customary to address Soviet officers as Mr. Abramov was a Siberian, about 35 years old, blond with a slender figure, with the facial features of an ideal German. He lived and worked before the war on the shores of Lake Baikal and in Altai. His main task, I think, was to agitate against fascist ideology and for Marxism-Leninism. He was obviously fond of conversations with the Germans, but the subjects of the conversations had not the slightest business with political agitation. He would go into the corps in the evenings, looking for Germans he knew with some knowledge of Russian and trying to find out what their worries and joys were. Always a crowd of people formed around those who were talking, whose desire was to relieve some of the strain on their soul. Abramov in many cases managed to solve more or less difficult problems in favor of the prisoners, and thus he won the trust of the people. Caring for the welfare of the captives was one side of his work. The crowd would turn into an audience when Abramov was asked to speak about Siberia and the Altai nature, to which he readily agreed. More than one evening I was the interpreter of his dithyrambs to the beauty of nature in the Baikal and Altai regions. These were not stories, but songs of praise, panegyrics. And in fact he could sing. We asked him to sing folk songs for us, to which he also willingly agreed. We already knew where his accordion was kept. We would send one of ours to get the accordion, and he would start singing with such enthusiasm that all the listeners were delighted. You could see his eyes were moist and tears often flowed. Yes, Abramov became for me an unforgettable embodiment of the Russian soul. When in the 80s I had to work in Mongolia and fly over Lake Baikal, memories of this kind man came flooding back. Battalion Commander? When you say these words, they sound majestic, but there is no majesty in what lies behind this title in the special conditions of a prisoner of war camp. It's really a servant for everyone. The empire under my command is a large hall on the second floor of the enclosure measuring approximately 25 by 40 meters without any partitions. There are 500 bunks in 2 tiers, in addition, a red corner and a 2-meter-high plywood partition enclosing the commander's tier, in which a table and bunks are arranged for him and 4 company commanders. On the first floor there is the same hall with the same number of inhabitants and a large bathroom with wash basins, showers and toilets for the needs of 1,000 people. It is considered a great luxury to have steam heating and hot water for the sanitarium. The list composition of each battalion is about 500 men. This crowd is divided into 4 companies, each of which includes 6 brigades of 20 men. The commander is the only person who is exempted from withdrawal to production work. His main tasks are to ensure order, cleanliness and tolerable living conditions, without having the disciplinary power to do so. The working day begins with a morning rise. Then the senior commander has to synchronize the morning toilet and the brigade withdrawal to the canteen with the expectation that at the appointed time, all brigades are lined up for the morning inspection from where the withdrawal to work takes place. It is difficult, without witnessing such a performance, to imagine how difficult it is to solve such a problem. In the bathroom at the same time accommodates 50 people, and in the dining room no more than 300. The whole mass of people, numbering 2,000, is pushing in the same place. The commander-in-chief, all the commanders of battalions and companies are running back and forth like sheepdogs, shouting, swearing, demanding a more rapid movement of the viscous, indignant human mass. In the canteen, we have to mention again that it is time to get up and make room for the next brigades. The last brigades have just received bread and soup, barely had time to sit down, and already the bugler's signal sounds for inspection. In a hurry, they swallow their breakfast, and another sheepdog drives them out of the dining room. The entire roster is lined up in 4 rows. Now, for the first time since waking up, the commanders can breathe a sigh of relief. To establish the presence of the full roster is the job of the duty officer, who often agonizes for half an hour or more before he is sure that everyone is in place. The withdrawal to work is made and silence falls in the camp area. The only people left in the camp are the artisans, the sick, and the command staff. Now there is time to have breakfast and think about the schedule of the day. We have to clean the bathroom, sweep or mop the floor of the building, and do general cleaning. The primary problem is finding staff. There are no full-time staff for these jobs. Either do it yourself or find convalescents who come up with the most incredible tricks to hide from the eyes of commanders. Often I myself had to take up a broom or mop and clean up the corpse. There are repair works and cleaning of the camp area. It is necessary to paint the window bindings, walls and ceiling of the corpse, and so on. All this passes calmly. There is no reason to hurry. There is leisure to sleep in the afternoon, to read a book, or to translate the warehouse card catalogue of the base. But the most turbulent period of the day begins with the return of the brigades from work. People are tired, hungry, sullen, irritated. Their flow flows through the building not without shocks and arguments. The aisles between the bunks are crowded. It is impossible to get rid of a nagging neighbour. Someone, when climbing up to the upper tier with his foot, touches the body lying below, and there is already a swearing, which often turns into a fight. The acoustic background of evening life in the corps resembles approaching thunder. To eliminate 2 wild arguments is one of the commander's business. There is a call for dinner. The queue of brigades is established on a special schedule by battalion, company, and brigade. Why? People are experiencing hunger and fatigue. Whoever gets to the canteen first can undress before others and lie down on the bunks, closed his eyes and plugged his ears, thus shutting himself off from the seething mass of people surrounding them. God forbid that they do not get mixed up. Do not break the strict order of brigades. People know exactly on which day they have their turn for dinner. In the canteen, the commander replaces the entire complaints bureau. One was not given enough soup, another only water, the third is dissatisfied with the size of the bread portion, and most often they are right, to achieve compromise. The main task? You don't want to make either the complainer or the accused angry. The last line has returned from dinner, half of the staff is already asleep. But there are always small groups that will not stop making noise until you threaten punitive measures, the most unpleasant of which is the necessary evening cleaning of toilets. The lights go off at 10 o'clock, and in time the hum of human voices subsides, but the hum of snorers rises, amplified by the sounds of the back trumpeters. The atmosphere in the building thickens, especially in winter, when those living in the immediate neighbourhood with open windows can't stand the cold draught. This is how a normal 24-hour day is spent by the high command staff among the prisoners. One gets used to such a life in time, and boredom would set in if there were no special events. One day I was quietly watching over the performance of harvesting work as suddenly appears Lieutenant Colonel Romanov. I report in a military way. He goes around the building and says, Fritje, you must paint the window frames. Yes, Mr. Lieutenant Colonel, but where to get paint, solvent, brushes? Listen, am I the battalion commander? Am I responsible for the appearance of the corps? I said so and went. What am I supposed to do? The only way out is stealing. There's plenty of painting materials and supplies at Zavodstroi, but how to get the contraband out of the factory, where any person is subjected to a body search at the entrance? In case of theft, one should also take into account that theft of socialist property is punishable by imprisonment for at least 5 years. German prisoners of war were also put on trial for such a crime. We have to take a risk, but we have to take it very cleverly and thoughtfully. The problem was discussed in the evening in the circle of company commanders and brigadiers. We determined the place of storage of high-quality beige-coloured varnish. The question was raised: what kind of containers could be transported in full view of the guard through the gates of the factory territory? We came to the conclusion that the best way to use them was milk cans, which were lying around the building of the food warehouse. The transportation means could serve only that half-truck, which with a field kitchen on the trailer daily went around the working places of the brigades with lunch. On the cargo area of the half-truck there were wooden crates for bread and cans for tea. The number of places varied depending on the number of brigades working at the plant. We decided to carry out a reconnaissance in idle mode. That is, we loaded an extra empty can on the car, sitting on which I waited out the search at the entrance and exit gate. The search was carried out exclusively by girls and women of all ages, with whom I had to carry on a lively conversation and attract as much attention as possible from those more or less beautiful sentries. The comrades relied on my ability to flirt with them, using the Russian language as an instrument of communication. For a whole week, i.e. 6 times, this test was repeated. The women became more and more talkative day by day. I burned off a veritable fireworks display of jokes and flattering speeches every day, and not once did the Gales think to control the Biden I was sitting on. It was time to go from idle to combat. The lacquer from the factory canister was transferred to our Biden, but, alas, there was a hole in the bottom of it. The canister we chose had a rubber-sealed lid that closed with a hermetically sealed bolt. We can assume that such a lid should work properly. So the Biden was put on the cargo platform with the lid downwards, and I sat on it in the usual position for the guard. We stopped at the gatehouse. There was a search, during which I was not lazy to present to the girls a cheerful entertainer. As in the old days, the sentries circled around me, and my seat remained a seat. We set off with a noisy sigh of relief from the smuggler. Back in the camp, I got off the car and was stunned with horror. The frame of the half-truck under the Biden is all stained with that beige paint, and it continues to drip drop by drop. So, the airtight lid failed. How come nobody noticed this sign of the theft when they searched the place? It turned out that my seat was in contact with the starboard side, and the girls got up and got down by habit only through the left side. The punishing hand of the prosecutor was close at hand. The window frames were painted, but the camp director was not satisfied with that. It was necessary to whitewash the walls and ceiling, to paint the plinth of the walls with oil paint, and in the red corner on the wall to draw a red banner, etc. The way of acquiring materials remained the same. The method of acquiring the material remained the same, but we took turns sitting on the throne of the King of Thieves, i.a. we played Russian roulette. We played until the end without firing a shot. Lieutenant Colonel Romanov never once asked where we got the material from. One of the commander's tasks was to fight bedbugs, whose population numbered in the thousands per person. It was unsuccessful as long as the bunks in the hull were made of wooden boards. The Commander's Council decided to replace the wooden bunks with welded iron ones. They calculated the need for half-inch steel pipes, and it was crazy. Per person at least 10 meters, so for 2,500 people 25 kilometers. It was impossible to get such a quantity of pipes illegally. It turned out that it was possible, but only in a semi-legal way with the help of the Soviet administration. The old building of the camp served as a warehouse before the arrival of the prisoners of war. It was separated from the large central warehouse of the factory, with the inconvenience that the only access railroad track led through the camp along the loading and unloading area of our building. When the steam locomotive was running slowly, it was very convenient to jump from the yard to the open platforms and unload what was needed for the benefit of the camp. And approaching the actual central warehouse, the train had to stop in front of a fence. The driver got off the locomotive, went to the gatehouse, presented the necessary document, and in response, the duty officer opened the gate. The train started to move from the place and moved relatively slowly along the site. A conspiracy was organized with the participation of the Soviet administration. Information was passed through an employee of the plant's supply department about the arrival of wagons whose cargo consisted of suitable pipes. In some secret cupboard within the camp, a number of bottles of vodka were stored. When such information arrived, the vodka was delivered to the gatehouse as a gift to the locomotive driver for moving the train as slowly as possible through the camp. Able-bodied people to the platform to unload the wagons. The driver would slowly pass through, and the loaders would swoop on the wagons like ants and lighten the advancing load in a flash. Believe me, dear reader, that I am telling the real truth. No one from the plant management observed the process of pipe development itself, and the disappearance of a good part of the cargo on the way from the manufacturer to the consumer was considered, obviously, as usual costs of the socialist national economy. Within 3 months, the raw materials were accumulated and a team of fitters welded iron benches for all the camp residents. In addition to pipes, we needed 1.5 millimeter steel wire for weaving mattresses. 50 kilometers, which was obtained the same way. The welded generators disappeared from other workplaces, where the access of the car delivering lunch was done without any search. The camp director gave the initiative of the prisoners of war a very high commendation. The year 48 was approaching, the year of homecoming. This news was received with joy, but with restraint and distrust. There were, however, real optimists who by their example influenced the general mood of the people in the camp. The peculiarity of this group of optimists was that almost all of them were professional artists and were engaged in amateur art in the camp. Eyewitnesses said that some high-ranking officer of the Soviet army, after the surrender of the city of Wrocław, gathered quite a large number of representatives of fine arts and part of the civilian male population into one camp. Under the patronage of this patron of the arts, cultural life was to be revived in this ruined city. But the military are a very mobile people, and a successor soon appeared who was not enthusiastic about cultural affairs. He simply shipped the labor force to the Union, regardless of their professions. Thus, the elite of the cultural life of Wrocław, singers, actors, equilibrists and musicians, ended up in a large camp in Mordovia. It was dissolved in 1947, and several dozen captive artists ended up in our Lagotstvo No. 469-1. Lieutenant Colonel Romanov, having some interest, concentrated all this artistry in one brigade. It worked not 8 hours, but only 4 hours a day and on light work. It was thanks to this layer of people in the camp that amateur art developed very successfully. Estradas, theatre productions, operettas with a tenor in the role of a woman, concerts took place weekly. And here, in this brigade, was born the idea to meet the 48th year in a festive way. The matter was discussed in the Council of the Gods. It was decided to create a new stage, which had to comply with the latest level of technology. The decision was made from the point of view of the possibilities to get materials. Our experience with paints and steel pipes strengthened our self-confidence, and our conviction that such a task could be accomplished in 2 months. To describe all the ways in which materials came into the camp is impossible. It would take a long time. The most detailed information I received about the creation of the lighting structure of the new stage. I use the term lighting structure deliberately, because to call this thing just lighting would be offensive. Some brigades worked at the neighbouring CHUP. Among the members of the brigades, quite a lot of specialists, electricians. But there was its own base of trophy equipment, with a wide range of electrical goods of German origin. The ideological justification for the theft of materials. The Russians stole from us, and it's not a sin for us to return the stolen goods to German ownership. Lighting was designed with multicoloured spotlights, lower and upper soffits, combined in a large number of circuits. It was envisaged to create a switchgear with many fuses, switches and voltage regulators, etc., on which the director could play like a piano. It should be mentioned that at the GP at the gate was not searched, and our semi-truck with a field kitchen on the trailer went back and forth without stopping at the gate. The necessary materials were prepared and loaded on the car without arousing any suspicion on the part of our superiors, so the set of materials was delivered in 3 times. The new stage was illuminated by 200 lamps. The brightness of the lighting was changed by 5 regulators, and on a switchboard measuring about 1 by 2 meters crowded a lot of devices. The work on the stage was carried out by specialists with endless enthusiasm in the evenings and on weekends. The result was stunning. The stage was beautiful. Lieutenant Colonel Romanov was now and then interested in the initiative of the prisoners of war and nodded his head approvingly. The grand opening of the new stage took place on December 31. It began at 8 p.m. and ended at 3 a.m. The opening ceremony was held on December 31. Never before and never afterwards in captivity had I met such an enthusiastic It was the year of my return to my homeland. How could I not rejoice? The concert was attended by representatives of the plant's party organization, city administration, and other bonzes. Our camp chief proudly acquainted the guests with the achievements of the Germans, realized under his leadership. The holiday passed, we continued to work on further improvement of living conditions. In the locksmith shop of the camp worked specialists of the highest qualification, capable of building different mechanisms to replace manual labor. Carpenters were tired of sawing with a hand saw. Cooks were tired of manually turning a meat grinder, etc. It is not difficult to build mechanisms, but where to get the most important part of machines? Electric motors? There were hundreds of them at the chemical plant. The camp's need would not have done any noticeable harm to the plant, but how to sneak these things unnoticed past the guard. There was a suggestion, on the basis of which the problem was solved, unexpectedly simple. In chemical production there are explosive shops. The housings of explosion-proof electrical appliances are made absolutely hermetically sealed. Airtightness equals watertightness. Why not hide the motors in soup, wrap them in oiled paper and lower them into a field kitchen cauldron in which the soup level is quite high? The cooks, who regularly travelled to their workplaces with lunch, informed that the guard was looking for contraband in all cavities of the field kitchen. Even the chimney is picked with a stick. The lid of the boiler is opened, but the soup, the holy of holies, is not touched. Decided, realized. Half-truck with a field kitchen went to the chemical plant in the first place. At departure, the rest of the soup in the boiler completely covered the object dropped into the soup. The inspection of the boiler passed without complaints. Sold out of the factory 12 pieces of explosion-proof electric motors. The largest of them, with a capacity of 12 kilowatts, had basic dimensions of approximately 40x60 centimeters. However, we have to admit that on that day, the ration of soup had to be increased by 50. Locksmiths made a circular saw, a drilling machine, an electric drive for a meat grinder, a potato peeler, fans for airing the kitchen and other mechanisms, thus providing the camp with a high level of mechanization. I have forgotten a lot of things from those times, but until death I will not forget one event that took place in the spring of 1948. The camp director summoned the command staff of the prisoners of war and introduced us to the general director of the chemical plant. Like a doctor's round in a hospital, the whole group made a round of the camp. Romanov proudly showed the general director all our achievements and even called the name of the commander or specialist who had shown special diligence in the performance of this or that task. The general director inspected the entire camp with great interest and said that he was impressed by the results of the creative work of the Germans. Did he know that he was surrounded by a group of criminals who were engaged in a joint and strictly organized, multiple theft of socialist property? Did he know that to each member of this group the prosecutor, under existing laws, could award 3 times life imprisonment? Whether he knew, he did not know. But to us prisoners of war, the whole campaign seemed like a school of true socialism. The spring of the repatriation year passed, summer came, and sending home was out of the question. The international political situation had worsened. Former comrades in arms, members of the anti-Hitler coalition, quarrelled. The Cold War began. We were convinced that the USSR was holding prisoners of war as political hostages. Such development of world international relations could postpone repatriation indefinitely. The work of the political unit was completely paralyzed. The staff of the Soviet political unit tried to avoid discussing the question of repatriation in 1948. The only political question of that period. What were they to answer? That it was off the agenda. Small trains were sent to Germany, but only the sick, the old and others who could not work were released. People were getting gloomy. There was nothing to dream of having a merry New Year's Eve party. Physically everything was on a normal level, but the moral side became unbearable. In the pressurized, cramped quarters of the buildings, frequent quarrels arose and often came to hand-to-hand violence. A person caught for petty theft was almost killed. We should not fail to mention that with the normalization of nutrition began to revive and sexual functions of the body. Irritability and resentfulness increased chaotically. Attempts to bring one's organism to a diseased state appeared, which gave an opportunity to get under repatriation. The wise men suggested that this could be provided by swollen feet. One should only take plenty of salt, and they were silent about the terrible harmfulness of such prophylaxis for kidneys and blood circulation. And since the transports went home at long intervals, the adherents of such practice did not see their homeland. Mortality due to kidney failure was on the rise. Both Soviet and German superiors helplessly watched this evolution. in the course of which an internal tension unquantifiable was accumulating. We were afraid of the notorious explosion-like transition into a new quality, clearly interpreted in Engels' writings on historical materialism. No one could determine in advance the direction of the force of the explosion. The victims of a spontaneous discharge are those who are closer to its epicenter. It was a warm summer. The duties of the zone duty officer were carried out in turn by battalion commanders. This included night duty. I was not allowed to sleep. Every hour I had to report to the duty officer at the gate about the results of the rounds. I was eager to sit there and talk to the officers on duty. These conversations helped in mastering the Russian language and also helped me to get to know better the beliefs and habits of a Soviet person. Knowledge of Russian was also necessary for me, because my parents' place of residence was in the Soviet zone of Germany, and there was no doubt that a good interpreter would have a wide field of activity there. One warm July night behind the fence of the camp zone, I could hear accordions playing, songs and shouts of girls. It was a night party of young people. They had fun there, and I stood on the site, cut off from normal human life. Sadness seized me in my heart, sadness and tears. I corresponded with my relatives since the end of 1945. I received the first postcard from my parents by Christmas. They gave the return card to my school friend, with whom the correspondence began. She sent me her portrait. For these 5 years she had become better looking, and my wistful thoughts were directed to my homeland, to this old friend or to Gorky, where Jean was to live. It was at this time that I began to compose poems. The title of the first one, Longing for the Motherland, gnawing, burning homesickness. It pains my soul and tears my heart. Longing, like pain for the past, is strong, and my heart is waiting for a rendezvous with my homeland. But no matter how hard life is today, it's even worse to live here without hope. Hope gives patience meaning. When will we be happy as before? I'm afraid of losing faith and hope. They give me the strength to survive. How many terrible things fate has given me to know. I wish I could hear my family's voices. I want peace, happiness and love. That will help me come back. We'll wander together till dawn. Family and friends will gather for a feast. The second poem is dedicated to the girl whose portrait I keep as a souvenir, but I never saw her again in my life. She left with an American. Your image is not shared with your homeland? When I long for a foreign land. I don't think peace and longing are compatible. I can't sleep on a summer night. The taste of your lips and the blue of your eyes. I'm sure of my soul, that sorrow and cares will be gone. Only joy and love await us. I believe and know that one day we'll see each other, and we'll be drunk on love's words. We'll embrace each other gently and tightly, to the rustling of meadows and the smell of flowers. And one of those nights I had this thought in my head. Have I not redeemed for 5 years of honest work the part of the guilt that fell on me personally? Am I not now entitled to direct all my efforts to the cause of getting home as soon as possible? Is it a sin to cheat the treacherous jailer in my own favour? The only way out of the situation is through the simulation of some health disorder. But what kind of health disorder? How could I convince the camp medical staff that I was seriously ill without harming myself? I thought, for a long time, thought over all possible options and finally chose the best option, as it seemed like. I ate nothing for 3 days in a row without informing anyone about it. On the 4th day as a duty officer in the zone in the very morning turmoil, I rolled a large Makorachanaya cigarette and smoked it, inhaling the smoke to the farthest part of the lungs. The intense dizziness did not have to wait long. His heart hammered with increased frequency and even irregular pace. This was the long-awaited moment. I let my body collapse to the floor in the middle of a crowd of comrades, hit my nose on the concrete and remained lying as if fainted. They lifted me up, carried me to the outpatient clinic, and reported what had happened. The senior doctor in the camp was a very nice woman, Anna Pavlovna, who tried to treat prisoners of war not only with medicines, but also with human participation. She showed a marked sympathy for me personally. She examined me and diagnosed me with a severe circulatory disorder. She was right about that. I was transferred to the camp hospital, where I was hospitalized for 3 days until I was able to go to work. During the following time I performed my duties with the same diligence. A month passed, and I repeated the procedure in the same sense. I managed to change my appearance. The expression of my face was always sullen and tired, My gait was slow, my back was slightly hunched. I avoided talking as much as possible, which did not coincide with my usual behavior. Again, on the fourth day, a few minutes before the opening of the outpatient clinic, I smoked a cigarette, made a wound on my forehead with a knife, and lay down with my head on the metal grate in front of the entrance to the clinic. Blood was pouring out. The Dr. Anna Pavlovna found me in this position. She shouted, called her assistants to drag me directly to the hospital without examination. She already knew what kind of circulatory disorder I had. No one around suspected a simulation. It was clear to my comrades that I was exhausted as a result of working too hard. On the second day, Anna Pavlovna sat at my bedside and started a conversation. She sympathized with me very much, and the most interesting information for me sounded approximately as follows. You are, as I know, in captivity for the 6th year. You have gone through the experience of the camps at Stalingrad. You have used up the reserve of your strength by too strenuous diligence. I wish I could send you home. I made inquiries and found out that for some reason unknown to me, your repatriation postponed indefinitely. So you won't be going home from this camp anytime soon. The only thing I can help you with is transfer to the Central Hospital at the U.S. Star Station of the Kirov Railroad. There is an experienced internist. He will cure you, and maybe he will be able to send you home in time. I know him. I will write him a recommendation. I was not very comforted by this news. Any prisoner in the camp group knew that the regime in Usta was very strict. Newly arrived patients are thoroughly stripped of all their belongings, passed through the bathhouse and barber shop, dressed in a long white shirt and sent to the patient's building. There you lie or sit on a bed, but you are not allowed into the yard. Selected things are put in a bag with the promise of their return on the day of release from the hospital. But it is well known that from these bags regularly disappear such items, which on the day of arrival aroused the interest of the staff of the bathhouse, barber shop, or warehouse staff. There is an opportunity to save at least some of the souvenirs that I keep as relics. In Dzержinsk still live families of German intern specialists. One of them died. His wife, I was told about it, is preparing to move back to Germany. If it is possible to transfer these relics there, we can hope that they will get to Germany illegally. Near the apartments of these Germans works one brigade of the battalion, with the brigadier of which I am friends. I escaped secretly from the camp hospital, picked up the most important documents, wrapped them up, sealed them and gave them to the brigadier with a request to give the bundle to the widow. Thanks to the fulfillment of this request, I've kept a collection of documents from the times of captivity until today. I was also lucky in another respect. One of my comrades, who had recently returned from treatment in Usta, informed me that an old acquaintance of mine, whom I had met back in 1944 in camp, No. 165 in Talitsa, was working as a senior attendant in the hospital. I could hope that my property in USD would not be lost. By the word property, at that time I should have understood a civilian suit, soft boots, a wristwatch, and a plywood suitcase containing a large assortment of goods, which, according to internment specialists, were in short supply in the Soviet occupation zone of Germany, where my parents lived. In addition, I carried with me quite a few books, including classic Russian fiction technical monographs, which were later to serve as tools for better mastering the Russian language. The day of departure to the Central Hospital came. Farewell to friends was sad. How many things we had done, often at great risk. How many great successes we had celebrated. How many times we had opened the depths of our souls to each other. All of that is now at an end. Whether we will see each other back home is an open question. Keeping a book of addresses with you is considered a serious crime. There are several cases when during searches on the USSR border some prisoners of war were found lists of dead and deceased comrades. So they were returned to the camp, and when they were released, it is not known. So the farewell is forever in all probability. The transport with the 12 sick went on their way without a farewell search, accompanied by one escort and a nurse. From the station Igumnovo with a change in Gorky we arrived in Usta, and you what luck. At the gatehouse we were greeted by that old acquaintance. He personally took care of providing reliable protection of our property from a certain category of prisoners of war. So I am already in the corps and must appear to be very sick. I have practiced the skill of feigning illness with success, but now I'll be under constant medical supervision. Will it be possible to convince the internist that the purpose of this treatment is the desire to be sent home? I am lying on a bed with a soft mattress. The room is warm. I do not communicate much with my neighbours. Too busy with myself. Dinner is served in the corpse. Orderlies bring a bowl of soup to everyone sitting or lying on the bunk. The service is amazing. The truly sick are all around. Pneumonia, jaundice, tumours, ulcers, etc. Patients are truly suffering, and who am I? Am I ashamed? Yes, I can't get rid of this thought, but my tired body demands its own, so I sleep without dreams. The morning found me physically fresh, with a clear mind. My neighbour, an elderly man in his 60s, tells me about his medical history. To my great delight, he suffers from heartache, angina pectoris. I ask him about his symptoms and he willingly gives me infinitely valuable information. I sympathize and tell him that my symptoms are almost exactly the same. When I ask him which doctor is treating him, he responds with enthusiasm. It turns out that the internist himself suffers from angina pectoris. I am waiting for the doctor's rounds in a tense state, trying to sharpen my mental strength so that at the moment of the first contact I would not make a fatal mistake. The doctor came in, but by appearance it was not a doctor, but a nice bishop with the appearance of an old Russian man. Tall, slender figure, long beard, and the most outstanding phenomenon, his eyes. The sight of him is the epitome of Russian mercy. He came in and asked, "Who's free?" "Let's get up." He comes to my bed, says, "Let's get acquainted. I am Fyodor Andreyevich. I have a recommendation from Anna Pavlovna. She asks me to cure you. I think that first of all you will be treated with rest," he said, turned to his neighbour, whom he asked in detail about the symptoms that had appeared during the last night. The second day came. Fyodor Andreyevich was to make another round. The weather had turned bad, it was raining, and a strong wind was blowing. The neighbour complained his pain had increased. The doctor appeared, and it was immediately obvious that he was not well. He was walking hunched over. His facial expression showed that he was in pain. He asks me what I have reason to complain about. I told him everything I'd learned from my neighbour, only in different words. The doctor says to me, "I should complain about the same symptoms today is especially bad. Well, rest and be treated," and went on without examining me, at least by listening to the heartbeat. He prescribed for me some bad-tasting drops, which I took regularly. Thus passed a month in perfect tranquillity. At the weekly rounds of the chief of the medical unit, he heard the report of Fyodor Andreevich, talked to me on distracted topics and went away. But the expulsion from paradise was approaching in broad strides. All summer there had been talk that everywhere around, the detectives of the operations department were trying to identify war criminals. These were considered to be members of the CC troops, who could be identified very easily by tattoos under the arm, the sign of blood group. The compilation of the relevant lists dragged on for a long time, and rumours about possible inclusions in these lists were whispered by word of mouth. Among the SS men, one or another tried to remove the tattoo by cutting out a small piece of skin, but it left a scar. The detectives assumed such an attempt at disguise and therefore included in the list of all suspects who had such a scar. Consequently, they also included those who had been treated for a sweat gland ulcer that left a scar in that very spot. There were other cases of ambiguity of this omen. I met one pilot who was hit by Soviet anti-aircraft guns during the attack on Minsk. The damaged airplane reached the front line of our troops. He, wounded, was taken to the dressing station of an SS unit, where a prudent doctor gave him that notorious tattoo. According to Stalin's principle that in case of doubt the accused must be considered guilty, that pilot was put on the lists. I can vouch for the fact that he wasn't lying. From the stories I could judge that he was really a professional pilot, and the SS troops did not dispose of flying units. Well, at the end of October in the area of the hospital, there was an emergency. Employees of the Ministry of Internal Affairs troops were running around the zone in search of certain persons. 10 people gathered at the gatehouse, and among them was my acquaintance, a senior attendant. They were taken out of the camp, and the rumour radios spread the news that they were taken to the left, which meant to a special camp. Most of those accused members of the German Wehrmacht were detained for a long time. The last of them did not return home until 1955. Based on the fact that 3 of the accused were even taken away from the hospital patients, I could assume that I would suffer because of my political beliefs and whims. But I was left in my bunk, but not for long. That same day the camp commander appeared in the corps, addressed me with an oar. "Fritschy, I'm putting you in charge of the service. The work is light, the course of treatment continues. From the warehouse you will be brought clothes and your other belongings, moved to the household building. Get acquainted with the brigadiers and the work tasks of the brigades. It is up to you to get the servants out to their workplaces and to supervise the fulfillment of their tasks from tomorrow morning. You will be accountable only to me personally. He took me by surprise. I wasn't expecting this. Is that probably the reason for the strange behavior of both the internist and the head of the medical unit? Didn't they keep me in reserve in case of the departure of the acting senior attendant? From my personal file, they could very easily find out the necessary information about my working life during the period of captivity. Fyodor Andreyevich, with whom I later had conversations in a rather friendly tone, however, denied such a possibility. He insisted that the withdrawal to the left was no less unexpected for the camp chief than for the prisoners of war themselves. Here they caught me again. All the simulation was in vain. I starved twice for 3 days each, played the role of a seriously ill person every day for a whole month, suffered a sad separation from my friends, risked the loss of my property. For what? I'm standing in the same place where I stood a month and a half ago, an official who cannot be released until the camp or the hospital is completely dissolved. I can't help it, I have to listen to my superiors. Servants. These are the regular housekeeping staff of the hospital, to assist the medical staff, preparing and distributing food, keeping the area clean and tidy and doing craft work in the workshops. The handicraft part of the economy is extremely well developed. Each workshop has at least one senior person with master's qualification plus 3-5 specialists. Not only prisoners of war are provided with food. Half of their labor goes to cover the needs of the medical and administrative Soviet personnel. It is necessary to take into account the fact that U.S. Station is located near the distant railroad line and is considered a backwater where one can only dream of being able to buy manufactured goods. The task of the senior attendant is to receive tasks and orders from the superiors, to take care of their fulfillment, and to organize with the help of the head of the economic part the delivery of necessary materials and raw materials. The work of a senior attendant cannot be compared to the workload of a battalion commander in the former camp. The work is really easy. After the morning inspection to distribute daily tasks and during the day to monitor their implementation, at the same time, the need for supervision is limited to the yard section. Over the orderlies is supervised by Nakmed, and the kitchen and workshops are under the special patronage of the head of the household, who uses the services of the senior primarily as an interpreter. I have a lot of free time. I sit for hours, translating texts from technical books from Russian into German, then back into Russian, comparing the original with the back translation, correcting mistakes and thus better mastering the technical vocabulary. In the utility building next door lives a doctor, a woman in her 30s, Maria Ivanovna. She is very intelligent and educated. She knows not only Russian but also German classical literature, is interested in history and art, and helps me to learn a more literary language from the language of construction sites. She often invites me to tea, and conversations with her are very pleasant and enlightening. Unlike the story I told above about the first period of my captivity, she does not allow me to think about the possibility of intimate relations. During those 3 months, during which I commanded the servants with a brief interval, I learned various craft skills in the carpentry and locksmith shops. A favorite hobby became wood turning. I still have chess pieces made on a non-motorized machine in my collection of relics. In the evening, in a small canteen of the economic building, merry companies gathered, where rich craftsmen more than once treated us to alcohol. It cannot be said that we lived poorly in material terms, but the longing for homeland and freedom tormented us. I remember a particularly hard evening, the October holiday of the 48th year. Late in the evening, in the dark, I made my rounds and heard the noise of the festivities that took place in the administration house behind the fence of the hospital territory. There, the accordion was playing, women and girls were singing, dancing, shouting merrily. My heart squeezed, tears came out. I returned to the residential building, sat down and wrote poems which I brought home in memory. Red October. It's terrible what people have done to living people. We were free. Now we are slaves. And many people have laid their bones here, without any personal fault of their own. We've been living in camps for years, and they look at us like dirty cattle. There's no morality and no law in this country, and even love is like the instincts of slaves. The spirit of the people has been ruthlessly crushed, and feelings are trampled into the mud. There's no goodness in the heart like wild beasts. To them we are enemies and soulless scum. They dance, laugh and sing loudly, And how could it be? It's such an important holiday. And they don't care if the poor people die behind the fence. They don't care. It's a breeding ground for grief. What people have done to living people. All the laws and agreements are broken. We're wearing parts made of linen and rags. There's no strength left for patience. It can be seen that good material conditions of life alone cannot comfort the human longing for freedom, for the homeland, for love and tenderness. The reader may be surprised at the sharpness of this explosion of feelings after the fact that in these memoirs expressed so much about the generosity of Russian people, expressed so much about the preference which I was able to use. But it must be realized that we were living in captivity, the liberation from which seemed to be postponed into the distant future. That evening I decided to continue my illegal struggle to return to my homeland, to go. In the meantime, with the support of all artisans and yard workers, I had to equip wagons for the transportation of some of the patients to their homeland. We built bunks, restrooms, equipped the freight cars with iron stoves, provided mattresses and blankets. The hope to leave by this transport was cut off overboard when the chief of the medical unit announced that such patients would go as there was no possibility to treat them here. Some of the patients were carried on stretchers from the building to the wagon, laid on the prepared bunks, covered with blankets, bade them farewell and waved their hands when the wagons started on their way. Again I saw many tears from those who remained in captivity. In the middle of December, when the frost was 40 degrees, the thickness of the snow layer in the zone was almost a meter, I subjected myself for the third time to the procedure, thanks to which I got here to the hospital. The fourth day had arrived. In the morning, after arranging the teams to their workplaces, I got high again and lay down in the yard. I deliberately did not put on a hat and gloves. I lay down between two snowdrifts in one light jacket. I had to prove that I fell as a result of fainting. But in doing so, I made a fatal mistake. The number of people walking on this trail was very small even in warm weather. Now, with the severe frost, everyone tried to avoid the necessity of going outside. So I lay there, my ears and fingers reporting the onset of insensibility as a precursor to frostbite. Stubbornness struggled with sober reason. If I got up now, I had endured all the sufferings of 3 days in vain. I'd better let my ears and fingers freeze, but wait for the rescuer. Were my guardian angels lazy, or did they want to punish me a little for cheating? Lazy, but they finally showed up in time. One of the masters found me, immediately ran for help, carried me to the residential building and sent for a doctor. He arrived with a suitcase of first aid and gave me an injection to increase circulation. On his orders, I had to return to the medical corps. So once again, I found myself in the company of Fyodor Andreyevich. That was a success. The chief of the medical unit himself was convinced that I had some serious circulatory disorder. Again, I'm attached to a bed and confined in the medical corps. Patients are not allowed to go out, and the nursing staff is not allowed to enter the medical corps. The ban applies to senior staff as well. I had to play the role of a weak patient again. I tried to convince my comrades of the truthfulness of this theatre by giving part of my rations to my neighbours. I have no appetite, and I don't want to eat. A prisoner of war who refuses to eat the food offered to him must be seriously ill. My neighbours sympathized with me, even Fyodor Andreyevich regretted. That's what I told the chief medical officer. You can't put a sick man in a responsible position. Now I think we'll send you out with the next transport. Everything was going on a peaceful way, and there was time to dream about freedom, about homeland. But again that cursed but. It was December 24th, Christmas Holy Evening according to the Roman calendar. In the morning, as usual, the breakfast carriage drives in and the cook is about to distribute the soup. At that moment, an orderly from the neighbouring corps runs in and shouts, "Don't take the breakfast. There is a hunger strike. The Russians promised to let us go this year. The year is coming to an end, and we haven't heard anything about repatriation. And who gives such a slogan? While I was working as a senior servant, such an event was out of the question. We have astonishment and confusion in the corps. We don't know what to do. We've just woken up and suddenly we're being asked to make such a decision. There are 25 sick people in the room. If we're going on hunger strike, we'll have to be united. But it's impossible to get a unified opinion at the moment. In my opinion, to annoy the Russians with a hunger strike in this situation is simply not worth it. It's been 3 weeks since the last transport was sent. There will be new transports. The strike organizers are right that the Russians have let us down, but the punctuality of the Russians cannot be compared to German accuracy. Now in an hour, soon in a year. That's our experience. About the hunger strike, I have some experience. 2 years ago, a group of Hungarian officers began a hunger strike as a protest against the order to cut everyone's hair, knowing that in any organized breach of discipline, the first thing the operations department would do would be to isolate the instigators. These Hungarians announced nothing in words. They refused to go to breakfast and remained lying on the bunks. They answered monotonously with the same words only to the questions asked by the detectives. The senior officer of the group was taken away. After 3 days they surrendered. Only one, who had waist-length hair, continued to starve. He was force-fed for a week with a hose directly into his stomach. The order to cut the officer's hair was lifted. The hunger strike had reached its goal. No punitive measures were taken. It seemed to me that a hunger strike was not considered a severe breach of discipline. Still, the time for rebellion in our hospital had not come. To take responsibility for organized resistance, to get 10 years or more at this point is not smart. So we made a unanimous decision not to participate in the hunger strike. The cook returned an hour later, handed out breakfast, and the case was over. The flow of information from case to case appeared to be interrupted. The nurses made sure that there was no intercorps exchange. The window panes were covered with ice, so it was impossible to see what was going on in the camp. Still, one could feel some dangerous tension of the situation. The next morning, the chief medical officer appeared in our building. I was frightened when he came to my bunk and announced in his usual manner, "You have to get up and return to your previous work. We will give you an assistant. Handle this work. Do it." Now only I could inquire and make sure that the detectives of the operative department had conducted a lot of interrogations and decided whom to consider as the instigator. The accused were concentrated in the administrative building outside the zone, and from there 6 people were taken to unknown places. The new chief attendant who replaced me was also included in this group. Among them were all German doctors. Everyone regretted it, including the Soviet medical staff. They were highly respected. The people affected by this event were mainly the sick, whose medical care had deteriorated. I was no longer allowed to celebrate Christmas in the patients' quarters, and by order I had to return to the household quarters. Again I made a show of fainting in vain. January 2, 1949, mid-September, I will never forget this date. While going around the zone, I see a female figure, which seems foreign and familiar to me. Strange because she is not a member of the hospital staff. Familiar because of a memory signal. As we get closer, we recognize each other. Vera Goffman, she worked as an interpreter for an operative in camp. No. 469 Way. She addresses me joyfully. "How is it, Fritzsche, that you are still here? I thought you were released home a long time ago, and what do you do here?" I explain to her what's going on, and I can feel her mood lifting. She says that she has been appointed to the position of interpreter of the operational department of the hospital. She tells me that her superiors have decided to transfer her to this backwater with her daughter, an infant, without providing her with anything for winter life in the forest. I need immediate help. I have no warm clothes for the baby and me, no utensils, not even a bunk to lie down with the baby. Let me consult with the head of the hospital, and I will come back for further discussion. She came back and asked me to go with her to the apartment to see how empty it was. I was convinced that it was simply impossible for a young mother to live in such conditions. She was given a room 3 by 3 meters, with a stove on a brickwork, a table, a chair, and that was it. Her words were fixed in my memory with comparative accuracy. "Your specialists are able to provide me with everything I need for a normal life. The chief has allowed me to place orders in separate workshops on condition that the orders will be carried out after working hours. And I give my word that I will pay for each thing with money, and I promise that as a reward for such help you will go home with the next transportation, and the workers who participated in this case will go home." Well, I think it is unlikely that she will be able to go home, but if she pays with money, then it is already possible to take up such a case. By evening I called the masters, told them what the matter was, and asked if they were ready to help the young woman. Unanimously they said something like this: "Let's try. We'll see how she pays. Other than that, she's incompetent." Work began. Tailors tried on warm civilian clothes and sewed them from the material of German military uniforms. Shoemakers took measurements for shoes. A woodcarver cut pads. Warm boots were made from the shins of officers' boots. Tinsmiths made kitchen utensils from tin cans. Carpenters made a cradle, a bunk, a table and chairs, and even hanging shelves, and so on and so forth. Vera paid for each item, which was noticeably encouraging to the craftsman, and the amount of payment was determined by her, and she always found a proportional compromise between her capabilities and the expectations of the craftsman. The specialists tried to invent additional needs in order to prolong the given production longer. With all this business life, we were concerned about one thing: the fate of those 6 comrades who'd been taken away from the camp. For some time we waited for their return, but doubts began to grow. Where were they sent? Just to another camp? God forbid they should go to prison. The worst fears came true. It was in the middle of January when the officer on duty presented me with a list of names with an order to prepare the prisoners of war for departure to a neighbouring town tomorrow morning. My name was also on the list. The purpose of the business trip was to participate in the trial of the military tribunal in which our comrades were accused. Fear gripped me. Was the Gulag going to give us, prisoners of war, a clear lesson by the example of those people who were considered the instigators of the hunger strike? The tribunal at that time meant that there would be no acquittal, meant that the verdict was ready on the judge's desk before the trial even began, meant that the sentences on such verdicts were counted only in 5s. It was a sad train ride, and no matter how much I dig into my memory, I can't recall where we went. I remember only a relatively small room in which many people crowded together, most of them military men with officers' epaulettes. In the middle was a bench where the accused, our comrades, were sitting. We, the observers, were given a bench near the wall. We sat down. 3 more officers came in and the proceedings opened. One of the officers read aloud the indictment. He read the indictment with such a rapid flow of words that the meaning of the speech was unclear both to me, who knew Russian quite well, and to the accused, to whom the speech was translated by the interpreter. The interpreter could not cope with the case. She made gross mistakes. She did not have time to translate the text of the indictment verbatim because the speaker read without interruption and because of her insufficient knowledge of German. During the trial, she distorted the meaning of the court's questions to the defendants and the defendants' answers. My heart clenched. I trembled with excitement, inwardly boiling. I wanted to interrupt and explain what was wrong, but no one paid attention to me, calling for organized violation of discipline. Hunger strike was out of the question. Then came one of the worst moments of my life. They called me by my last name. The officer who was in charge of the case, obviously the prosecutor, asked me a questutor. Do you know that it is forbidden to go from corpse to corpse in the hospital? Yes, I answered, but yes, I was not allowed to continue. I was about to explain that. For example, the prisoner of war doctors had to work in all 3 buildings as needed, but they lived in building No. 2. How could they do their work without going to another corps? No one prevented them from doing their work until now, but suddenly it was called a breach of discipline. There were times when members of the kitchen staff fell ill. To help, the cooks then sent the necessary number of people from the yard, which when distributing food had to go from building to building, and so on. But most importantly, none of the superiors during my entire stay in the hospital paid attention to the non-fulfillment of that rule of the regime. I raised my hand to ask for the floor, but no one paid attention to me. The speech of the so-called defender was pitifully pathetic. I have no memory of the individual phrases of his speech. I only remember that I was seized with helpless rage. Is this a trial? No. It was a tragedy according to a prearranged scenario. The order was to rise. The verdict was announced immediately after listening to the defense counsel's empty speech, so the verdict was prepared before the trial began. All my life I could not shake off the thought that my one word, yes, might have been the drop that justified the stipulated sentence. Having reached the present page, the reader has probably been able to see that my memory has firmly fixed many details of the events of that period of my life. But I cannot pull the content of the sentence out of the depths of my memory. The imprisonment, the labour camp are all that is remembered. Obviously, at the moment of the announcement I was in a state of shock, which blocked my brain's ability to perceive the events going on around me. I never met any of the defendants again in my life. Making inquiries about the fate of former prisoners of war in the GDD was considered a crime rather than an act of humanity. If there is even a small part of guilt on my conscience that my comrades had to suffer from the injustice of the Soviet judicial process, I assure you that for the rest of my life I will mentally apologize to them. I hope, however, that the worst did not happen to these defendants, and there were rumors about it. In 1946, one prisoner of war was taken out of the camp because of some theft. The superiors announced that the thief had been put on trial and would be recompensed. A year later, when I was still engaged in atoning for the guilt of the German people, I received a postcard from Germany from this criminal. We returned to the camp in a gloomy and sad mood. The other witnesses of the court spectacle followed the strange proceedings only through the words of the interpreter, and were all the more indignant when they heard from me what had really happened there. To be fair, I would still like to mention that Soviet prisoners of war in German camps were hanged without trial for calling for an organized breach of discipline. Life in the hospital eventually returned to normal. It should be noted that the court shock by no means affected all the residents of the hospital. The residents of the camps defended their position in the following terms. What do I care? They are doctors, intelligent people. Couldn't they soberly assess the conditions in the hospital, where the majority of the staff was sick and isolated in separate buildings? You could see from afar where the source of the outrage was. During 6 years of captivity, they should have been convinced that the Ministry of Internal Affairs bodies were not ceremonious in finding any instigators and punishing them. They had to reckon with the fact that the investigators would immediately expose them, and who benefited from this hunger strike. They sacrificed themselves for nothing. The arrangement of Verina's household was nearing its end. Specialists continued to present various proposals for improving the household, but Vera was content with what she already had, and she was running out of money. Honestly, she paid for everything, but she never spoke another word about repatriating the specialists. Apparently, she had overestimated her ability to influence those who sat at the helm of power in determining the composition of the next train to Germany. The winter was particularly cold. For weeks the frost was just below 40 degrees. Firewood for heating the buildings for the summer and fall were prepared in adequate quantities, so we did not have to freeze in the living quarters. One fine evening in the middle of February. In the evening, the company of members of the service sits in the warm dining room of the household building. Some are playing checkers, chess and cards, others are carving wood, drawing, reading. Suddenly the assistant officer on duty, a prisoner of war who serves as a liaison or messenger, appears in the door. "No. Fritzsche, you are to report to the operative immediately. Oh, how tired I am of dealing with this department. Apart from the operative, no one else could bring the hunger strike case to the court level. I hate him terribly, unsympathetic both in appearance and in his treatment of prisoners, a widespread custom of operatives. After unsatisfactory interrogation to put the interrogated in the punishment cell, he practiced it often. The punishment cell is a small closet within the gatehouse booth, where the operative's bureau is located. The booth is built of logs, and in the punishment cell the gaps between the individual logs are not corked, i.e. the wind blows through the room. At 40-degree frost, it is not easy to spend the night there. That's why we adopted such a preventive measure, to dress very warmly before coming to the operative. In a tone of friendly mockery. My comrades advised me not to forget about warm clothes. I put on cotton pants, a cotton jacket, felt boots, a fur coat, and a Ushanka hat, and went to the villain where, however, I saw Vera. The operative's bureau is hot. The iron furnace is red hot. Vera Goffman sits beside the operative and looks at me encouragingly. I ask permission to take off my coat, and the operative replies in a threatening tone. "No, sit down. It's time to put an end to your misdeeds. I'm tired of dealing with you. We'll draw up a protocol." I am frightened. I start digging through my memory, but at the moment, honestly, I can't understand what misdemeanors I have. But what is a misdemeanor, he, the damned operative, can arbitrarily determine. The familiar procedure of drafting an interrogation report begins. Personal data includes forefathers, distant relatives, etc. Just to record personal data usually takes half an hour, no less, no more, and I am steaming. Sweat is pouring all over my torso, and the bastard operative won't let me take off my coat. "Well, we're done with the personal data," he said. "We need to solve the case. Tell us exactly in which Hitler organizations you were a member." I am surprised that none of the previous interrogators had ever talked in this direction. I explained that the main organization for young people aged 14 to 18 was the Hitler Youth, of which I was a member. But I have a denunciation that you were actually a member of the C Special Squad as well. Now I realized where the wind was blowing from. Someone from the runners in one of the past camps, not finding a black spot in my life, made up such a denunciation that I had concealed before Soviet intelligence membership in this political special unit. That informer must have known that the slightest discrepancies in the data of the next protocols aroused suspicion that the interrogated person was deliberately concealing the truth about his identity. Since in the Soviet justice system suspicion was equal to proven guilt until the accused could prove his innocence, such a denunciation was a ready verdict. Instantly realizing the significance of the question, I remembered the hint from Anna Pavlovna, the doctor in the former camp, that she herself saw no chance of sending me home. She had evidently made inquiries with the camp operative, and the latter had explained to her that some dangerous war criminal might be hiding under the mask of this Fritz. In the daily practice of the operations department, the accused did not even know that he was being investigated. I realized that this interrogation was a big chance for me. If this devil believes my statements, then maybe a way home will open up. There is an opportunity to prove that I could not have been a member of this unit because of my age. In the protocols of all interrogations, the date of my joining the German Air Force was fixed. May 1, 1941. I was 17 years old at that time, and say members were accepted only from the age of 18. That's how I explained to the operative that the informer had lied. Now everything depended on this man's disposition toward me. He might or might not believe me. My future was hanging by a thin thread. I'm surprised that the operative, having heard my accusations, is silent and writes something. I'm sitting there drenched with sweat, waiting for a decision. Suddenly he said, "I'll read the decision aloud to you. I think you'll understand it without the intermediary of an interpreter." During the interrogation, prisoner of war F was asked a question about his membership in the fascist organization SAE. He explained that only civilians over 18 years of age were accepted as members of this organization, however had been conscripted into the fascist Air Force at the age of 17. The text of the protocol decision did not exceed 3-4 lines. The operative invited me to sign the protocol page by page. It was difficult to hold a pen in a hand wet with sweat. Sweat dripped from my forehead onto the paper, but somehow I managed to sign. The operative, with a theatrically important expression on his face, placed the report in a folder and said, "Fitche, you'll have to take the next transport home." The meaning of the words was delayed in reaching my consciousness. What did he say? Do I have to go home? Just now he wanted to put an end to my misbehavior. Logically, if he sends me home, he'll put an end to my misdeeds. Oh, you rascal. That joke was very close to mockery. I was pensive instead of showing an explosion of joy. Like a movie, before my eyes ran pictures of my hunger strikes, which, as it turned out, experienced in vain. Now fate had confirmed that it had guided me to my goal along a rocky path. Was it not true what the gypsy fortune teller had predicted? My happiness is a happy rescue from misfortune. Without clearing my record, repatriation was out of the question. The cleansing has now been done, and there is no doubt that it happened at Vera's request. She seemed like a patron angel to me now. What means she used to convince the operative of my innocence will remain an eternal mystery to me. Slowly I came to my senses. I wanted to show joy, but my smile was distorted by streams of sweat that poured from my forehead through my eyebrows directly into my eyes. Faith evidently misinterpreted the change in my countenance and speak. There is reason to weep for joy. Now it's really soon to go home. Just like that, they let me go back to the corpse. There was a hard frost in the yard, and the cold air fell upon me with a thump. Was it really true what they said? Wasn't this a new kind of bullying and torture? It was hard to believe. But Vera had never let anyone down during her entire stay in the camp. We can hope. But what would happen to those specialists whom Vera had promised to clear the way to their homeland? It was better not to rejoice, not to open one's soul to anyone, better to keep silent. The prisoner's deepest wish, to be set free, had come true. The service specialists prepared the wagons again, this time for about 150 people. They familiarized us with the list of those to be repatriated. And in it, in addition to the patients of the medical unit, there were both me and those craftsmen who decided to trust Vera. What a play on words. This woman's name was Vera. We believed in her, and with that faith we were not lost. A stone fell from my heart. Deep respect for Vera grew even more when we learned that the head of the economic section, learning about the repatriation of specialists, exploded in a fury. The living sources of considerable wealth were about to fly away from him, and he stood helpless before the decision of the all-powerful operational department. What kind of struggle played out behind the scenes, it remained a mystery to us. It was a demonstration of the power of the Chekists over the production workers. We set off on February 26. Vera warned us in advance that we would go to Germany with a GAC. The first goal was Balakna. The Balakna POW camp was the first in the Union to be completely dissolved as a reward for the highest labour performance. Our stay in Balakna camp was short, only 3 and something weeks, but I can't help but include in these memories the events we learned about during this period. A kind of news exchange worked. It meant that we were aware of how the prisoners of war were living in the detention centre. In 1945, there was terrible news about the Balakna detention centre. The work of unloading wood from barges was extremely hard. The food was very poor, and people were dying. That's how the nickname Death Camp was formed. Everyone was afraid to go there. In 1947, the flow of terrible news from Balakna stopped. No one paid any attention to the camp anymore. Now we had the opportunity to learn from a direct source what had happened there. The moans from the camp eventually reached even Moscow. A commission of the GUPVV appeared. The chief of the camp was allegedly put on trial. The entire staff was replaced, and a major named Fix was appointed chief of the camp. Aju began to act according to the motto, "Live yourself and let others live." The whole staff of prisoners of war were released from production work for a certain period of time. Fix explained in Yiddish, which the Germans could barely understand, that he would open the gate. There was no point in running away anyway. A fugitive would be caught for sure. It would be better to look for work in the civilian population, someone as a craftsman, someone as a yardman, someone who might be a friend of a lonely woman. You can earn rubles or groceries. You can have fun. People worked, who worked as well as they could, and quickly recovered. When it was time to return to work, the physical condition of the guys was normal. It is difficult to think how it was possible to raise the performance of norms on average in the camp above 200, but there was no reason to doubt this fact. At workplaces was maintained extremely free mode. 200% was given by the brigade, and the bosses and convoyers looked through their fingers at the search for work on the left. They began to earn cash from those organizations that had no prisoners of war on their books. For such a regime, the Germans willingly repaid with selfless labor, when Chief Fix sometimes at night lifted the entire train to unload a barge. Everyone believed that the payment for this labor went into the chief's pocket, but no one grumbled about it. At the border, at the transition to the European track, the freed persons were subjected to a thorough search for the last time. They were looking for all sorts of notes. They were afraid that the prisoners of war could inform the public in Western countries about specific cases of deaths of comrades in Soviet camps. A list with the addresses of POWs who had died or remained alive in the camp, discovered during this search, was tantamount to a return ticket. For the sake of simplification, it was customary to take away everything that could serve as material for recording, which meant all books, notebooks, and plywood boards. The latter because skillful craftsmen had thought of hiding the lists of the dead in the bottoms of plywood suitcases, the export of which from the Union to Germany at the time of my return was already forbidden. The discovery of the hidden lists could lead to additional punitive measures. Such events were by no means rare. What did I have? A bag made from a sugar sack. It contained many riches which were rumoured to be in short supply in the Soviet zone of Germany and which I had accumulated as a gift from my parents. Soap, thread, needles of all kinds, buttons, both press-on and plain cloth for dresses and shirts. In addition, 10 technical monographs, a short course in the history of the All-Union Communist Party, and about 1,000 cigarettes. But the greatest treasure I consider to be about 100 photographs, which in Camp No. 469 were taken and sold officially, with the permission of Major Reutberg, the chief in charge of the political part. I was ready to sacrifice a lot to save these photographs. In the camp, we were given a certificate with a stamp of an institution of the Ministry of Internal Affairs that the photographs had been censored and were allowed to be exported from the Union. But would the inspector recognize such a certificate as valid? In the middle of the large hall stood a long row of tables with narrow aisles between them. In front of the tables were long lines of graduates waiting to be searched, and behind the tables were controllers in the uniforms of the Interior Ministry troops. Everyone had to empty their bags and all their pockets, placing all their possessions on the table. The controllers took each item in their hands, examined it for hiding places, and put it aside. A body search followed. Each controller had a tall metal drum with him, into which items deemed inadmissible were dumped. If the items on the table were satisfactorily examined, the person to be searched was allowed to pass along the aisle between the tables and was allowed to gather his possessions into his bag and pockets on that side. The one who was let through was already in the white zone. It was my turn. I diligently laid out all the items, including photos, and presented the sacred certificate, to which the controller paid no attention. But I devised a special strategy to win the controller's favour. Out of 50 packs of cigarettes, I put 5 packs on the very edge of the table above the drum, and when further arranging them, I touched them with my finger so skillfully that the trajectory of the fall had its end in the drum itself. It was evident that the controller noticed the willfulness of my action, but he continued to examine the pile of items with a fixed face. Technical monographs, my favourite textbooks, he declared unacceptable and carefully stacked them on top of the cigarette packs in the drum. About the short course on the history of the All-Union Communist Party, he hesitated and called an officer over. Flipping through the book, the latter authorized the admission of this Bible of Stalinist crimes. Then the controller read my certificate with great interest and did not even look at the photographs. Hurrah! I wanted to shout when he let me through the aisle. Only now the degree of hope of being released increased to 90. There were rumours that one prisoner was released and brought back again. He was let through the border in Brest and returned to the camp in deep Russia after a 3-day stay in the Soviet camp in Frankfurt on the Oder. Again we boarded the wagons, which were now rolling on German-wheeled gimbals. Major Fix was still travelling with us and was concerned for our welfare. As we passed through the large forest of eastern Poland, he ordered us to keep the doors of the wagons closed, because the danger of the Echelon being fired upon by Polish gangs could not be ruled out. A German railroad worker said that a week earlier in the same area Polish bandits had stopped the train with a barricade of logs, attacked the military escort, stripped them, and took away their weapons. No harm was done to the Germans. This is the explanation for the fact that at each stop of the train the guard jumped from the car and arranged in a defensive order with automatic rifles at the ready. So we travelled through Poland in 2 days with very short stops for food. The mood was rising with every hour. Guys began to sing songs, laughter started to rise more and more often. We became merry in our souls. On April 8, 1949, about noon, we crossed the Oder River near Frankfurt, crossed the new eastern border of Germany. Major Fix led the column from the sorting station to the Soviet repatriation camp, where we were placed in barracks, fed and lined up to hand out documents of release from military captivity. For the last time Major Fix gathered his guys for a farewell. I can't convey his speech in words. I only remember that many of them and I too had tears. He finished, and suddenly a group of strong men approached him. They lifted him on their shoulders and moved on their way around the camp. We sang cheerful songs to thank this real man in this way. But we're still under Soviet custody. We had to spend 1 night in this detention until the order was given to line up for departure to the German Red Cross camp. I can close my eyes and replay the events of the next hour in my memory like in a movie. We are standing in lines at the gate of the camp area. A brass band and 50 Red Cross nurses are approaching the gate. At the command of the officer, open the gate. For the last time we move on the command's right and step march. The brass band takes its place in front of the column, moves off, and to the music of the band we march along the road to freedom. Nurses accompany the column from right and left, and who can tell how many litres of tears have wet the surface of the sidewalk of this highway to a new life. In front of me is a new stretch of life, the problems of which are not yet clear. Behind me are 6 years of a life that has been hard, very hard, by the highest measure. But my thoughts keep returning to the words of that gypsy woman whom we met on the bank of the Kliazma River. She predicted the truth, salvation from misfortune. The war has devoured millions of people, but I'm alive. The war maimed millions of people, but I'm healthy. Should I call this result a misfortune? Besides, I learned not only the Russian language, but also many other things. I survived the years of captivity for a reason. And there is a lot to remember, strange as it may seem. The further I got away from Central Russia, both in terms of distance and time, the clearer it became to me that I would never be able to get rid of my longing for Russia in my entire life. Today it is also clear to a 75-year-old man that this longing is centered on one person, Zahana. On the certificate of release from military captivity, I have the date, April 8, 1949. We were sent to the nearest railway station. I had 30 marks in my pocket, a very modest salary for 6 years of atoning for those who were not captured. In Berlin, I saw for the first time a German city destroyed by bombs and ground fighting. I stood at the carriage window and struggled to hold back tears. It looked very much like the ruins of Stalingrad. But the sight of the capital of one's native country has a different effect on a person than the sight of a foreign city. My brother met me at the station and took me home on a cart with a mule in harness, passing near the church of my native village. He showed me the place on the memorial plaque to those who had fallen for their homeland, where my name and surname were written until August 28, 1945, with the date of death on June 20, 1943. The news that I was alive was brought to my parents by a comrade who had been released from the Stalingrad camp in July 1945 because of chronic dystrophy. My older brother, a squadron commander, decided to declare me fallen because the crew of one of our bombers had allegedly seen an airplane over the Caspian Sea that caught fire and fell into the sea. Due to the fact that that night all airplanes except ours returned to the base, there was no doubt about the death of the lost crew. I got a job sooner than I could have expected. As an interpreter in one association of national enterprises, I was arranged without any verification of my knowledge and professional experience. Translators of Russian with technical education were in extreme shortage in the Soviet zone. I found a workplace through the mediation of a classmate's family, who had not been in captivity and had just passed the exam of a certified geologist at the university. How I envied him. I was paid a good salary, and I was able to cope with the work without much effort. My thoughts can't get free from captivity soon. I keep returning to those patrons to whom I owe my release from captivity, to the Dr. Anna Pavlovna and to Vera. Not less often my thoughts fly to Gorky, where Gian lives. I sat down and wrote letters to the doctor and Vera to the addresses of the camps. Sincerely thanked them for their patronage and help. And Jana, how could I tell her what was going on in my heart? I know her name, but her surname and address are unknown. It is not even known in what organization she is engaged in the amateur art circle. It's so frustrating that it brings tears to my eyes. The doctor and Vera did not reply to my letters. They were afraid to correspond with a foreigner. They work in the system of the Ministry of Internal Affairs under Beria. They know that more than one official at the USSA was handed over to the executioner because of connections with the Germans. It's a pity. I wanted to tell them again and again that the memory of them will always remain in my heart. I live alone in a small room, as a lodger in an apartment of not very nice people. On August 20, I return from work, and on the table there is a letter with a very unusual appearance. A letter from the USSA, and who could write me a letter from Gorky? If anyone in the USSA knows my address, it is only the address at my place of birth, where my parents still live. Who is the sender? Malikova, this surname explains nothing. The name Zena, without patronymic, impossible. How did she manage to find out my surname? How could she find out my current address? A miracle. I read, Dear Kolya, it has been a long time since you and I saw each other. We were near each other for 2 hours and quickly parted. It was a fleeting, but for me, for a long time, remained in my memory, a short meeting. Everything was official, new, and it seemed to me that I was suddenly in another, unknown to me, world. Everything was good, and looking into your eyes with a clever sparkle, both cheerful and sad at the same time, my heart was pounding for some reason. After the concert I looked for you, but I couldn't find you. And then fate confronted me with your friend, who gave me your address. Before writing, I hesitated a little. I don't know if you remember me. How are you living? How is your health? You haven't been feeling very well lately. Have you married or not? And if not, why not? If you could only imagine how much I want to see you, but this time 2 hours wouldn't be enough. I'm writing Kolya, and in front of me is your photo. I asked Sasha for it. But it's from 1947, and I'd like to have one from 1949. If it will not be difficult, maybe you will fulfill my wish and send me your photo. I will look forward to your reply. Regards, John. What happened to me at that moment, words cannot describe. So sympathy at first sight struck both participants of this extraordinary event, passing fleetingly behind the scene in the prisoner of war camp. Only a brilliant writer can put into words the state of mind in which I found myself when reading this letter. I sat down and wrote a reply. I live well, I am not married, because I have not found a wife yet. My health is normal and how I would like to see you. I wanted to, but thinking soberly, I soon came to the decision that it was only a dream and should remain a dream. The Soviet system of Stalin's time did not provide for friendship, love, or marriage of Soviet citizens with foreigners. One comrade, a prisoner of war in the camp where I lived, in 1947 fell in love to death with a Russian girl and submitted an application to the USSR Ministry of Internal Affairs that he wished to become a citizen of the USSR and marry this girl. The answer was negative. After release from captivity, you will be able to legally apply for RCR3 citizenship. Another barrier was the fact that in the defeated Germany, even under the rule of the occupying troops of the Soviet army, life was freer and materially better than in the USSR. To go to visit her there was not worth thinking about. To invite her to come to visit us would contradict all the principles of Stalinist state security. One question remained open. Who was this Sasha, and how did he get my address? The question of the address was quickly clarified. The first workplace did not suit me very well. I put an ad in the newspaper Neues Deutschland that I was looking for a job as a technical translator with my full address. This was the newspaper that was regularly made available to the staff of the Central Anti-Fascist Activist Organization, which was located in Gorky. Jana calls Sasha my friend, and he had my picture. There is no other solution. This Sasha was transferred from the camp from Igumnovo station to Gorky and met Zana there. Consequently, he remained in captivity, serving the 8th year of captivity. Fate treated him harshly. A month later, a second letter, which should have been included in the literary fund of mankind. I don't think any literary man could have invented such word. My dear, you can't imagine what great joy your letter has brought me. I've been waiting for it for a long time, and one fine evening I was performing on stage in one of the concert halls of Gorky, and I was very nervous before going on stage. At that very time I received a phone call from home and was told that a letter had arrived from Germany. I, having lost all hope for your answer, decided that the letter was from Sasha, and I was glad to hear from him. After all, he is a wonderful man. Everyone who knew him had a wonderful opinion of him. If he were with you, I would not worry about you. With such a friend and comrade, it is easy and simple to walk, even on an uneven path. You and he seem to be different people. I know you very little, but it seems to me that by nature you are very capricious and unstable. Maybe I'm wrong. Anything's possible. Kolya, I was struck by your knowledge of the Russian language. To know the artistic language is a great achievement. I really did not doubt your abilities, but after your letter I applaud you in admiration. The fact that you are not bored and work hard is very good. That you are not married is also good, as I don't want you to belong to anyone. Oh, if you only knew how glad I was to get your letter, and what was done to me when I found out who it was from. I turned pale, then red, and suddenly whirled about in a sort of frenzied waltz, to the great surprise of my mother, who was playing some sad nocturne. When I read that tomorrow you will be acting in one of Goethe's plays, dancing at a beautiful evening, I felt very sad, because of the fact that you will smile not for me, your eyes will laugh not for me, and you will dance not with me. I'm sad to the point of tears. Kolya, how I want to be near you. Can't you come back to us because you love my homeland and my people? I wish I could. Write, my dear, about everything. I will wait impatiently for your answer. Regards, Jan. Romeo and Juliet in the socialist camp. With my mind I realized that the way to Gorky was finally closed. It was impossible to get a passport in those years, and besides, the Gorky region is a closed one. To offer her to come to Germany would be like a mockery. No ordinary citizen from a closed region was allowed to go abroad in those years. Sad, one can only cry and dream. Correspondence became rarer and went out. Dreams remained. I still work as a translator, only now on a private basis. I have a private translation bureau, work to do enough. I translate technical books from Russian. In 1956, my first Russian-German metallurgical dictionary was published. I finished my correspondence studies for an engineer, but I live with the political stigma of an enemy. I was expelled as such from the SED back in 1952, and an enemy can't even think about going abroad. Among my clientele is the Research Institute of Refrigeration of the GDR, whose director is very satisfied with my translation work. He has to go to Moscow for an international congress, Before the higher authorities and the party bureau, he defends the opinion that he can successfully participate in this Congress only with a translator who has technical education and knowledge of the case. Strange as it may seem, in the summer of 1958, I am issued a service passport. The date of arrival in Moscow and the hotel where we will live are determined. It is impossible to keep silent that I am already married and have a daughter. But it is impossible to erase Zana from my memory. Conscience forbids me to think about meeting Jana, and my heart suffers at the thought that I will be close to her and will not see her. The heart has won. Hard as it was, I told my wife about it. She, though not with admiration, gave her blessing to the adventure. I wrote a letter to Jean's old address. The answer, "I will come to Moscow, very glad to see you." How naive I was. It was like a crime to hope for such a meeting, because the security bureaucrats on both the Soviet and GDR sides were vigilant in making sure that slogans about Soviet-German friendship remained only slogans. But laxity and ugly performance of duty made the impossible possible. Cadres on foreign business trips were strictly forbidden to make contact with the local civilian population. Some employee of the International Cooperation Department of the Ministry was obliged to inform me about these rules. But for the first time in the period of the Ministry's existence, a private citizen was included in the delegation. Measures to such public dinosaurs were not described in the instructions. So the corresponding instructions did not reach me. At the same time, the director of the institute did not really observe those instructions of higher authorities, the meaning of which he did not recognize or understand. The contract of the participant translator with the director of the Institute for Participation in a business trip to the USSR was concluded for the working days of the week, i.e. excluding weekends. There would be no payment for the weekends, and therefore no responsibility on the part of the head of the delegation for those days. The collusion was discovered, but too late. Formally and legally everything was in order, but the ministry officials considered the arrangement a bad trick. The way to meet Jean was open. I sent a telegram. The return telegram was handed to me at the Beijing Hotel Beijing to member of the delegation of the German Democratic Republic Klaus Fritschie, leaving for the meeting Wait Beijing 7th 10 Dum Bamai Jenna. I look forward to meeting you. Saturday and Sunday are days off for me. Someone from the delegation expressed bewilderment that I have to spend my free time in Moscow without a guide translator, but the director of the institute reflects all attempts to undermine my plans. Since 9 o'clock, I have been sitting in the hotel lobby. I am waiting for the meeting and dreading it. Any psychologist would explain to us that dragging the past into the present is impossible without a dangerous loss of quality, especially in matters of love. Jean and I fell in love with each other in an instant, as if lightning had struck us. This embryonic love grew into a giant in the absence of the subject of love. These imaginary mental strains had no time to discharge anywhere. Some great imaginary happiness has descended upon us, and it is too late to catch up with it. But apparently neither Jean nor I are willing to think rationally, to throw off the burden of unfulfilled love. God forbid it should be so. The hall door opens, a young woman walks in, stops, looks around, and with a flash in her eyes and an unforgettable smile approaches me. Recognized me, and I would have walked past her on the street. Embarrassed. Her image in my memory is fixed in a long black dress, with a hairstyle for a performance on stage, and in front of me is a woman who has travelled 300 kilometres in the clothes of a normal railroad passenger. The friendly greeting is not without signs of shyness on both sides. We sit in the hall for a short time. It's crowded. I feel ridiculous. We both have a desire to escape into shared solitude. We agreed to go for a walk in the Gorky Memorial Park. We managed to release tension and walk all day in beautiful fall weather. We spend another day together. We sit on a bench under the Kremlin wall, basking in the sun. We visited the tomb of the unknown soldier, envy the young couples who are having a wedding celebration. Then we go to visit Jean's sister, sitting on the edge of her bed as she lay down due to a severe headache. Those were happy hours, running through the present without thinking about the future. The question of what might have been if one had managed to cover the long distance back in 1947, 11 years ago, is not touched. 2 days in that unnatural world to which we were thrown in our time behind the variety stage. I'm afraid that Jean has not quite lost hope for a future together after all. The way back to the real world is hard for both of us. The real world does not let our dreams come true. Parting is not without tears. But before parting with Gian, I asked her a request. In 1955, the Russian-German Metallurgical Dictionary compiled by me was born. Remembering that I learned the basics of technical translation on the basis of trophy equipment, I dedicated this work to Nikolai Porfiryevich Kabuzenko. Such a phrase is printed on the first page of the book. When I left for Moscow, I took a copy of the dictionary with me, dreaming that there would be a person to whom I could entrust to look for N.P. Kabuzenko and give him such a souvenir. Jean agreed to take on such an almost impossible duty. The letter carrier brought a letter from the USSR. The sender was N.P. Kabuzenko. A miracle. Nikolai Porfiryevich tells that his son worked at a brewery in Gorky. Someone, allegedly from the enterprise's management, asked him if he knew a certain Nikolai Porfiryevich Kabuzenko. When he explained that he was the son of this man, he was handed a dictionary with a request to give it to his father with the story that I was supposedly a member of the delegation that, headed by Erich Honecker, visited the city of Gorky. This version remained the only one for me until 1998. I finally managed to find out what really happened there. In front of me lies Gian's letter of December 30, 1998. It is best for me to transcribe verbatim what she writes. I've only been to Igumnovo station once since our meeting in Moscow. Either you didn't explain it well or I didn't see anything but your eyes, and I didn't find Kabuzenko's house. It's full of new houses, new people have appeared over the years. Then I went to Kamchatka, and when I came back, I went to an evening technical school, and my friends got me a job as head of a convoy at the Volga brewery. In one room with me sat a dispatcher who wrote out orders for state farms, collective farms and farms to receive waste from the production of beer, a porridge that was apparently very useful for fattening cattle. I didn't think that I would ever find N.P. Kabuzenko or see you, so I kept the dictionary as a memory of you. And suddenly I heard the dispatcher next to me writing out a consignment note to some Kabuzenko. I don't remember his name now. I think it was Nikolai too, or maybe I'm confused. The man was not wearing a hat, but a very handsome face. So I asked him if he knew Nikolai Porfiryevich Kabuzenko, and he said it was his father. Then I said your name, and he was surprised and pleased, called you Kolya Fritz, said that you were friends. Then I asked him not to leave, to wait a little, got in the car, and brought the book from home and gave it to my father to give to him. I regret that I didn't ask more questions. They were in a hurry. Here is a miracle or another accident of a special kind in my life. So rich in such events. We corresponded with Nikolai Porfiryevich. I had an opportunity to express once again my true gratitude for all the good he had done for me and for many German prisoners of war. To him I owe the fact that despite the stigma of being an enemy of the party, I lived and worked safely as a specialist. Good specialists, thank God, in the GDR, as a rule, were not killed. N.P. Kabuzenko lived in our Zamas at that time. I wanted to invite him to come to visit me and my wife. In the 60s, the conditions for tourist trips to the GDR were finally created, but the correspondence was cut off without giving any reasons. I believe that Nikolai Porfiryevich worked in the nuclear industry, whose employees, they say, were not allowed to maintain unofficial ties with foreigners. August 1989. The longing for Russia has not gone away in these 40 years. After meeting Jean in 1958, I visited Russia several times a year on business trips. After the publication of the second technical dictionary on power and material handling equipment, I left the profession of translator, and the constellation of the Taurus again made itself felt. At the zenith of professional success, I was looking for a new mountain, climbing to the top of which promised new interesting events. From the Research Institute of Refrigeration, within the framework of scientific and technical cooperation, I often visited Moscow. The official language in Kame was Russian, and I was valued as a specialist with experience as a translator, but I could not get to Gorky. Perestroika came, Glasnost came, and completely new opportunities opened up. I planned an individual tourist trip to Russia, which I described in the 8th chapter in connection with the Perek-Futkin events, along 2 lines. First, to sit at the wheel of a sports plane, at least for a minute doing my favourite sport. The second is to visit the places where I spent the best years of my youth. As for flying sports, the exclusion from the party entailed very undesirable consequences for exclusion from the Society of Sports and Technology, and thus deprivation of the opportunity to fly gliders, which I was successfully fond of in 1952-54. The flying fields were enclosed by a high fence, and the only contact with aviation was visual, standing behind the fence and watching the flight of gliders and motor airplanes. As a subscriber of the magazine Technics of Youth, I found out about the upcoming airshow Riga 89. Through a Moscow friend, I got an invitation from the magazine's editorial office, flew to Moscow by airliner and travelled by train to Riga, where I actually managed to fly. I could not have imagined that 2 years after the unification of Germany, at the age of 68, I would be able to acquire my pilot's license again. I have already told you something about Gorky, but I kept silent about the fact that the meeting with this city revived my memories of my unfulfilled love, which had flared up for 2 hours behind the scenes in the prisoner of war camp in Samuvo. I longed to meet Zana. Going around the city, I made sure that the houses at her address had been demolished. Where the house with her apartment should have stood, we found an undeveloped site. There wasn't much time for searching. As a member of the GDR delegation, I had to fit into a set schedule for the day. My heart was weeping, but still, just one stay in this city raised strong emotions in my soul. In the Gorky Opera House, as a reward for hard work, I watched Eugene Onegin and Soroshinskaya Yarmarka sitting in the front row in front of the stage. As part of the illegal exit to the city, I visited the Nizhny Novgorod Fair, stood on the square with the monument to V. Chakalov, admired the panorama of the confluence of the Ok and the Volga. Now, as an old man, I celebrated a new meeting with the places that filled a large cell of my memory with the conviction. Gorky is Gian. October 1997. I am a 74-year-old old man, but my vitality has not left me. The unification of Germany has changed many things in our country, and technological progress has made things possible that had never been thought of before. Since the reunification of the GDR and FARG, I was still working as a specialist in refrigerated warehouse design, and despite my age, the boss of a prominent refrigerator construction company asked me to work for him for a couple of years. I agreed, but it turned out to be 2 couples. I finally resigned at the age of 71. We former citizens of the GDR learned many things after unification, including how to use a personal computer. In this field, a new side of hobbies opened up to me. The development of programs for physical technical calculations. An electronic telephone book of the whole of Germany appeared in the stores. If you enter a person's surname and first name into the computer, a list of all persons with these initials living in Germany will appear on the display within seconds. With the help of this technology, I tracked down my friend from the time of military captivity, Alexander. He returned from captivity 6 months later than I did. In 1949, we even corresponded, but soon correspondence from him stopped coming for some unknown reason. Since a surname like his was not very common in Germany, I had to write and send no more than 16 letters to different addresses. After 48 hours, a phone call rang at my house. It was Sasha. I immediately got into the car and went to see him. At the meeting, memories and more memories. One of the topics, Gian. It turned out that Sasha had met Jean under the same circumstances as I had. In the spring of 1949 as an interpreter conferencer at a variety show in a prisoner of war camp in Gorky. His advantage was that he lived in Gorky and had an interior ministry pass, which opened his way to limited freedom, including Jean's company. She told him about a brief meeting with a certain Kolya who had performed with her on stage in the spring of 1947, and Sasha guessed that it was me. He gave her my address and a photograph of me, in which she recognized me, of course. That's the explanation of how Jean's letter got to me in 1949. Sasha did not catch the further course of events because of his return to his homeland. Contact with Gian he no longer maintained, as he got a job in one of the firms in the Furgy, where employees were forbidden to maintain personal ties with citizens of communist states. The Cold War was underway, which suppressed correspondence between the 2 former prisoners of war as well. During long conversations with Sasha, the first idea of real memories and the second of finding Jean were born. The prospects of solving the first task seemed quite realistic, with the condition that the author's ability to work would be preserved to the necessary extent. Formulating the last lines of this story, I can say that Sasha and I evaluated the prospects of this event correctly. Another thing was to find Gian. As it is known in European countries, it is generally accepted for a woman to take her husband's surname during marriage. And what data did we have for finding Jane after 40 years of contact with her? Only her name. Her maiden name and the fact that in the 40s she was engaged in amateur art in the gawky house of culture, which long ago disappeared from the face of the earth. My life is full of quirks and unique accidents. And so it happened in the case of Jana. We found her immediately, but a big role was also played by the fact that she had not forgotten Collier, and Collier had not forgotten her. My longing for Russia entered its next phase. This longing focused again on the one person who had gladly accepted the friendly treatment of the German who had so suddenly burst into his life in 1947. I leave it to the reader to imagine what goes on in the souls of people who have kept their love for more than half their entire lives. A love that remained a germ within the real world, but in the world of dreams affected by this feeling grew into a giant.